All right, so I can see Elizabeth is here. Hi, Elizabeth. It's great to see you.
Hi.
So, I've just been telling the class a little bit about you, and I've put your bio up in the chat. So I won't reread all of Elizabeth's bio, but suffice to say that I met Elizabeth within the first few weeks. In fact, I think it was the first few days of me coming to DC to take up my role here in 2017. And at that time, Elizabeth had created UN Women DC. And she later was essentially whisked away to New York to work on the UN Department of Peacekeeping, to work with them. And she worked as a gender advisor there. I know she has some very interesting case studies to share with us here tonight. She was also, let me have a look, UN World Humanitarian Summit involved in the Humanitarian Summit, I should say. And prior to that, Elizabeth worked at various NGOs in New York and London. So you can see her bio there in the chat. I think we have a wonderful opportunity to hear about Elizabeth's experiences at the United Nations and to engage in conversation, kind of have a behind the scene peek at her work at the UN. So Elizabeth, I'll hand over to you and please you lead our conversation. Thank you.
Thanks, Shirley. Thank you for the nice intro. Will say at the outset, I'm going to do my best to keep an eye on time. I'm usually pretty good, but if I'm not, just sort of give me a wave or interrupt, and that's no problem. Because I want us to have time so I can answer the students' questions and we can have a bit of discussion. So I thought it might be interesting to focus on my work in peacekeeping and working with the Security Council and talk about how does the UN staff work with the member states on the council? How do you exactly pursue your objectives through their work, and specifically in reference to the work that I was doing in New York, working on the Women, Peace, and Security agenda. So I was going to sort of lay it out a bit overall and then talk specifically about one peacekeeping mission, one of the older peacekeeping missions in Lebanon, and how we managed to sort of expand and strengthen that peacekeeping mission's role on WPS. And that was just this summer. And actually, it was particularly interesting because it was being negotiated right after the explosion in the port in Beirut. So you had an evolving situation that impacted the negotiations as well. So the Security Council, so just to say the sort of obvious that all of you will know already, is it's made up of member states. So the UN peacekeeping, UN staff members are international civil servants. We are not political appointees. We work to implement the work of that department. We work with the security. So it's almost like the Department of State, right? It's all civil servants there, or foreign service officers, and they worked with if they are working with Congress, those are the elected members, right? And they're supporting that legislative work. So the Security Council members are the government representatives we work with. The diplomats are the appointed representatives, and we are supposed to be providing them with sort of impartial technical advice to support their efforts for the council. And a lot of people, particularly anyone who follows the Women, Peace, and Security agenda, they think about the Council's work in terms of thematic resolutions. So the most famous, we just had the 20th anniversary of the Women, Peace, and Security Resolution, Resolution 1325. It's one of the only resolutions that's actually known by its number outside of the UN. And certainly the thematic resolutions. So I'm talking about women, peace, and security. There's other thematic areas such as the protection of civilians, children in armed conflict. But while thematic resolutions provide the council, peacekeeping missions, and UN agencies with a sort of overall framework and principles, they don't really provide a sort of blueprint for either governments or UN agencies in terms of activities, what they should exactly be doing, nor is there a whole lot of accountability. So normally there would be, so for the WPS agenda, every October, there has to be a WPS annual report submitted to the council. So all the different agencies who work on it say, this is what we're doing. It is a form of accountability for sure, but it's a little bit more loose. Whereas when you have mission mandates, so either peacekeeping missions I'll be talking about, there's also special political missions, which is when a country is no longer deemed to be sort of very post-conflict, but further along, and so there aren't peacekeeping troops anymore. But they have mission mandates say, this is exactly what the UN should be doing. This is exactly what the host government should be doing. And the Security Council is going to watch you and going to track and ask you through verbal reports, through written reports, if you're actually doing this. And there's also sanctions to back up some of those actions if they don't implement them. So really, if you want to look for some place where you can get lots of implementation on the issues you care about, you're looking at the peacekeeping mission mandates themselves rather than trying to get your work done through a thematic resolution. So I would work with the peacekeeping missions in the field and be sort of the liaison between the gender units in the field and the Security Council members when the Security Council was reviewing those mandates. Most missions are reviewed on an annual basis. Others where there have been sort of recent developments, usually not good ones. So if there's been an outbreak of fighting, if there's been a coup, things like that, they might just have the mandate renewed for 6 months, sometimes even maybe 3 months, but generally mandates are renewed for a year. So the one I'll be talking about, Lebanon, it's certainly a year. It's also one of the older ones. Like I said, it's been around since the 70s. There are much newer mandates. Most of the missions in Africa are a lot newer, so the 90s or even more recently. So there's 14 in all, and not all of them have 14 peacekeeping missions. And I should also be clear that not all of them do have gender units or gender advisors. Again, some of the older ones, which are patrolling border disputes, so there's one for India and Pakistan, those don't have a gender unit, and there actually aren't even any civilians involved. Peacekeeping missions normally have 3 different components: police, military, and civilians. But again, border disputes, it's generally just the police and the military, and therefore we don't have gender advisors out there looking after any sort of women peacekeeping work. One thing, I am sorry, going to just backtrack. I made notes for myself and now I just went back and looked at them instead of talking. One of the things I was going to say was that in the 2 years I was in peacekeeping, I just finished up this summer, was that when I was talking about the thematic resolutions, there were 3 thematic resolutions that were passed: one on sexual violence, one on women, peace and security, and one specifically on women peacekeepers. None of those were resolutions anyone wanted, except a couple of member states. So whereas peacekeeping mandates, they have to be reviewed and renewed. We either say they rolled over, that means that nothing's really changed and they're mostly just ticking over, or they will be opened up, we say, and different paragraphs negotiated to reflect changes on the ground. With the thematic resolutions, the UN staff and NGOs advise the member states not to even introduce these resolutions because they don't always have to have a new resolution, even if, say, women, peace, and security is being reviewed every October by the Council. If the community feels like we have enough, as I said, it's the thematic framework, right? It's the guiding principles. We have enough there is no need for a new resolution. And the more resolutions you introduce, the less seriously they are taken with the thematic agendas. And the other problem that we've had in the past 2 years, and we had sort of pleaded with the council not to run those resolutions, was because we had particular political challenges on the council, and there were member states who could not be relied on not to water down what was already in previous resolutions. So we were all quite happy with very strong language we had in previous resolutions, and we were worried about those being opened up, reconsidered with new resolutions. In the end, there were huge battles around two of the three resolutions I mentioned because of those regressive elements at the council. And no one would say that those were positive resolutions. They became exercises and do no harm. But member states sometimes like to be able to say to their countries, and they think politically it's a great public diplomacy thing to say that they passed a resolution. So that happened anyway. So that's sort of like a little, sorry, an interesting aside, but I thought important also for you to sort of understand how things work. So for the mission mandates, which do have to get, even if they're rolled over, they do have to get considered either, like I said, 6 months, usually a year. So UNIFIL, so sort of Lebanon mandate, they all have all fascinating acronyms and sometimes very awkward to say. That comes up every summer. So in August, it was being negotiated. I mentioned it ended up coinciding with the bombing in Beirut. So I knew that the mandate was coming up for renewal, that the last time it was really opened up was 2 years ago. And in 2018, it was the very first time that language on women, peace, and security had appeared. This was right before I started. And I will tell you that when I asked who got that language in, because there was no one doing the work that I started doing in September 2018. Before I got there, there was no one really engaging with the Council for Peacekeeping on this issue. I asked a couple of member states, and I got an answer which you often get is multiple members took credit for that language. So I don't really know who got it in there but lots of members were happy to take the credit. So 2018 was the first time there was WPS language, and the mission was asked for the first time to basically mainstream gender sensitive work in its mandate. So it sounds sort of, it's a bit fluffy, and it's not the most helpful language, but it was a start. And because, remember, I talked about the 3 different components, because even though there is a civilian component in Lebanon, the head of the mission is actually a force commander. He's military. And so that can make it more challenging for particularly older military men to take this area seriously. So now that the gender advisor out there had something concrete in the mandate, she found it much easier to do her work. And it actually also allowed her to support the government of Lebanon to put together a national action plan, which was the government's first, on women, peace, and security. So that was the first change that had been made. And I knew that had started in July 2018. So this summer I went to her and I said, what do you think about the mandate? Do we want to ask them to open up our language? Do we want to ask them to do something differently? And she was very keen to do something, because just like everywhere in the world, in Lebanon, gender-based violence, violence against women and girls, was increasing because of COVID. And they had some concrete data on that. So the UN there has a gender-based information management system, GBVIMS they call it, and that's UNFPA that collects that data. And they were collecting a lot, they showed an increase. The data was showing an increase in cases that was occurring. Lebanon, the Lebanese mission was also getting, the senior gender advisor was getting lots of calls from NGOs saying, we've got an uptick in cases, we need your help. She was not allowed to do this because gender-based violence was not written in the mandate as an area in which she could work. So she was sort of desperate to be able to help because of the situation that was unraveling because of COVID. She also raised with me that there were increased challenges to 2 problematic laws in terms of women's rights in that country, which is the personal status law, which is there is no personal status law in the civil law in Lebanon. So it depends what religion you belong to, how women are treated in terms of marriage, divorce, being able to own property. All those things are left up to your religion rather than any civil law, making women incredibly vulnerable. The other thing is that Lebanese women cannot cannot transfer their citizenship to their child or their husband. So you have many young people there who are actually stateless because their fathers are not Lebanese. And again, with COVID, this is becoming an even bigger problem. that you have more unemployment, more people unable to earn income, poverty increasing, and also these vulnerable women who are being abused by their husbands don't want to leave because they're at the mercy of whatever their religion would say in terms of their rights. So she was very anxious to be able to work on these. The Security Council has an informal expert group, they call it, on women, peace, and security, which will meet occasionally throughout the year before a mandate to review the situation and to decide if they want to do anything. Lebanon is not on their agenda. That agenda is evolving, but Lebanon is not on. It's a smaller mission. It's not usually a complicated one. And further, the council has a tremendous amount of work. It's also been tracked that every year it holds more missions and had more meetings and has more work. So what I did was I looked to see who is responsible for this mandate. So that's France. France is the one that we call the pen holder. For historical reasons. And it's always one country that holds the pen on a mandate. I had a very good relationship with France, and France has been very strong on these issues. So I went to them ahead of time and said, can we hold an informal meeting with all the countries who are members of that group and not go through the usual mechanisms? This will make it much easier. We'll pull everyone together. I'm creating a 2-page policy brief that we'll also give out to people to help them. And France loved the idea. The 2 co-chairs of the group were happy to not have to do extra work and just to have us do the work instead. So see, everybody is normal even when you get to the Security Council. So if a co-chair doesn't have to do work, they're happy. And so we pulled that meeting together. So basically the senior gender advisor from Lebanon was briefing about 10 members of the council. So what we call the P3, US, UK, and France, and all the elected members who are positive on this issue. As we were briefing, the bomb exploded. So that changed the dynamics. So it helped us and it didn't help us. I had already worked with France on a new paragraph that we were asking them to insert in the resolution that was being circulated, the new resolution that they would circulate. On one hand, our argument was strengthened even more. The Lebanese people were becoming much more vulnerable, right, because of this bomb. So that much was obvious, and a lot of people saw that as obvious. However, there were other countries who were using this as an opportunity to try to change the mandate, such as the US decided that it wanted to push for more political reform and to have the mission have a greater role in political reform. The US also wanted to lower troop numbers of the mission, not have as many troops on the ground. That is a common US ask, particularly under the current administration. They want to drive down costs everywhere. So then, even though you have people who come to your meeting, understand what you're saying, are on board, they suddenly start to line up on these other hard security issues. And so it's like, who will now defend what you want in there? So France took the first step to put the language in what we call the 0 draft, which was circulated. And that can be the biggest challenge, right? Who's going to put the language that you want in there in the first place? So they did that. But then countries who had said, oh, I might be able to support this, we're now having to use their political weight or leverage to go for other issues. And so did not want to necessarily come out and add their voice to the support of that, when other countries, so China and Russia, are always looking to shrink mandates. And they never want WPS, frankly, to be in a mandate. They call it a Christmas tree approach. So as in you're hanging extra ornaments on all the time, and mandates are becoming unimplementable because they're too big. So China and Russia were against having any new language. And then something I didn't see coming was someone asked that the gender-based violence language be switched to conflict-related sexual violence, because that became a bit trendy in the past year and a half since the new conflict-related sexual violence resolution was introduced last year. And I had to sort of very politely say, but there is no conflict-related sexual violence really there is no ongoing conflict in Lebanon. It's not an issue. you're actually not understanding the difference between domestic violence and violence in the home and conflict-related sexual violence. So that took extra energy to deal with that. So basically the idea is we convened the group, we sent around the policy brief to back it up, updated the policy brief after the explosion. I lined up my allies. I lost some of them because they dropped off to push for other things, but then having to constantly follow up with the ones who were still backing me. I had to keep getting new copies that were circulated as the language changed. Like I said, if I hadn't kept my eye on the ball, it would have been changed completely to conflict-related sexual violence instead of sexual and gender-based violence. And then Russia came in at the last minute and said, no, we want it completely out, everything. So I pretty much had lost any reference to the legislation and to helping them get a right, to support movements on changing this legislation. And so I had to go into a bit of a huddle with France to say, well, what are we going to do? And what we decided to do was to anchor it in. Lebanon had by now passed the National Action Plan on Women, Peace, and Security. The government had passed it. So I mentioned that the mission in the last 2018 mandate had started working on that. The government now passed it. We went to the mandate and saw that it had gender-based violence in there. And that UNIFIL, the mission, was recognized for supporting the government in the mandate. So the language that we proposed for the resolution was rewritten to say to support the government of Lebanon in implementing the National Action Plan, including on sexual and gender-based violence. And so then Russia said, okay, fine. You've shown the link. You've shown that they've already been working on it, that the government has recognized their support for this work, and that the gender-based violence is referenced in there. And now I will, and the Lebanese gender advisor are also going to interpret that as, well, they can work on anything in that National Action Plan, because it says National Action Plan, including sexual and gender-based violence. So while quite obviously they will work on gender-based violence, they now have the sort of latitude to be able to work on other issues. And so in the end, that is what we got passed. So sorry, I think I spoke a little bit longer than I had intended to. I spent more time setting that one up.
Not at all, Elizabeth. That was fascinating, and bravo. I just want to say bravo. Well done on, behalf of the women in Lebanon, says Shirley, but no, seriously, I mean, that's incredible that you were able to do that. And thank you for setting out in such specific detail how, who the pen holder was, and how you were able to work with France and then bring in other allies, and then the complexity of countries who were very against this change in mandate, like you said, obviously Russia and China, but they did come back around at the very end once you were able to apply it to the broader Lebanon mandate in terms of their own national action plan. So thank you for setting all of that out for us, because I don't think many, if any of us, well, I don't know, maybe some of the people in this room have worked for the UN. Has anybody here worked for the UN? I'm not seeing anybody who has, but certainly to share what was going on in terms of these processes is really, really helpful. So I'm just going to, before we move on, just want to ask any questions at this point. Does anybody have any questions they want to ask Elizabeth in relation to this particular case study that she's just shared?
Good question. I mean, I was sort of aware that I was like throwing out jargon. It basically means who, pen holder in a sort of literal sense, that they are the one who draft the resolution. And yeah, so I guess that's that. They are seen as the lead in the council on a specific issue. And it can be both a thematic or a country situation. So there is the UK is the lead on women, peace, and security agenda that I mentioned. France is the lead on Lebanon. It means they are the country that Whenever a meeting comes up, they will chair it. If a document needs to be drafted, they will draft it. For the country situations, it's pretty much an ironclad thing. For other things, it used to be, and it's shifted. I mean, things have changed a lot everywhere, right, because of the Trump administration. And one of the things about the Trump administration was that it was very selective in what it paid attention to at the UN. And it really didn't care about certain things that any other administration, including, I'm not talking Democrat, Republican, any other administration would have. And so the conflict related sexual violence agenda was actually established by the United States. It was Condoleezza Rice who was the one who came down to New York and ran that resolution. The United States had drafted the very first one. So it was very important to the Republicans as well as the Democrats. And last year, or a year and a half, whatever, I guess it was fall of 2018, when Germany had mapped out that the first month it would have the presidency of the council as an elected member was going to be in March, which is when that agenda is up for review. And they wanted to be all splashy and have a CRSV resolution. That is the US's area. And the entire community said, please don't run a resolution. So not only did Germany not listen, but Germany went behind the US's back and drafted a resolution all on its own without the US. And again, it was really the US abrogating power because the US and New York told them not to do it, but they really didn't have any backup and Washington wasn't really paying attention. So when on a Friday night in February, Germany emailed it to the US and said, hey, here's a draft resolution. Tell us what you think about it over the weekend and we're going to circulate it on Monday. Again, I think honestly, even if Nikki Haley had still been there, I think she would have told them like what she thought about them. But without even Haley in place and no one caring in Washington, there was basically a collective shrug, and the U.S., gave that up to Germany. And so now who is the pen holder? Technically, it's still the US, but sort of Germany took it last year. So I would say that's sort of up for grabs. And it's not an isolated issue. And I went into sort of detail there again. But it shows you what happens when the US, or if another country did that, does not pay attention at the UN. And it also shows you that the sort of power of what elected members now believe that they can do, because Germany did that. So what's to stop any other now elected member from being like, I quite like this area. I think I'd like to be the one in charge of it, or at least like co-pen holder with you.
Thank you so much. That was really, really helpful.
Okay.
Yes, thanks, Elizabeth. Elizabeth, I'm just wondering if you can tell us a bit more about the next stage in the process. So UNIFIL now has this mandate with the sexual and gender-based violence component, and that's also in the National Action Plan, which is obviously creating space for women's rights and civil society groups in the Lebanon to fight for women's rights, particularly on those issues that you mentioned in terms of passing on citizenship, divorce law, etc. But in terms of the UNIFIL mandate itself, how then is that mandate with these new gender components, how is that fed back in to the Security Council and into the UN, like in terms of accountability of the actioning of the mandate, the implementation of the mandate on the ground? How do we then know that this has actually led to some change in the implementation of UNIFIL?
So we obviously informally will brief the field. But what they will get, which is very formal, is a code cable. And and this is one of the things I learned when I joined peacekeeping. There's a lot of very formal sort of military inspired processes that happened. that happen. And this literally looks like an old fashioned, it's like double spaced typing. There's like stamps that go out on the top of the page. And it, says from the Undersecretary General to, and there's like, I would draft like content, but you need the sort of admin support who knows exactly how to write these things, because they get this in the field, and that is like, like their Bible. They just say, okay, this is what we need to do now. And so they look at the language, and then they will sit down and say, okay, how do we need to change our action plan? What do we need to do to implement this? And so that will go to the head of mission, who then will send it to the head of the gender unit, who will be asked to come up with actions to respond to it. Now, that doesn't mean that everything is always implemented as well or, systematically as it should be, but that is the process. So she will have had to update her action plan, formally respond to the head of office and explain how she is going to implement that. What interestingly does not change is there will be no dollar sign assigned to that. There will be no... The budget committee actually is a completely separate, different process. And that'll be another class, Shirley, while we talk about like the arguments that happen in the budget committee, which happens in every spring. And Security Council members who didn't get their way in a mandate, a lot of them think, that's okay, I just won't allocate money for that in the budget resolution. And so that's how they undermined things. Nice and sneaky, right? But so that's how, this is what the UN has to do. But then there is the reporting mechanism. So, okay, once a year, the mission mandate gets really formally reviewed, like I've talked about. But then generally there will be briefings in between. So every 3 months or every 6 months. And those would normally, sometimes they will come to headquarters to do them, but then other times they will use a sort of secure, video teleconference where the head of mission will brief the council, and it's not as thorough, obviously, as the annual one, and there won't be a big report like we write for the annual ones. It will be an oral briefing, but they still do brief them and will provide highlights on what they are doing. And that's another way for us, we can drive accountability. That way is we can always, I can go to, and I have for certain things, I will go to a Security Council member and say, hey, head of mission is going to brief you on this. Can you ask a question about? And if a Security Council member is asking a head of mission at a formal briefing about a specific issue, that's very important. They make note of it, and the head of mission will go back and say, hey, I got questions on this. Like, we need to have more next time. We need to do more next time. So that's another way to sort of drive accountability.
And would the mandate include actions like working directly with local partners and experts in the field, women's groups, NGOs, that type of thing? Would it go into that level of detail in terms of the direction, or is that what the gender advisor advises?
If I could, ideally. So we have gotten further with the mandates for South Sudan, for Central African Republic, and Mali. And I believe all 3 of those specifically reference civil society. Mali absolutely does. Mali has been a sort of challenge. The government obviously is both the government's been a mess. The peace process has been not well implemented. But that was one of the areas that we have pushed very hard, that the government needs to work more with women's groups, and particularly around the incorporating them into the peace agreement. That's what we're always pushing for, more women's engagement in the peace processes. So yes, we are often, and those are much bigger mandates, much bigger in terms of the size, the budget, how many personnel we have, and what they are supposed to cover. And so we are able to sort of get into more details with that. But I would also say that the story I told you is not unique in the sense that, like, if you don't have someone like me there all the time, you are less likely to get that sort of, way less likely to get that specificity that is ideal. Yeah.
And actually, I'm just going to open it up first to the class. Any other questions?
And they can be dumb questions. I mean, I've been so technical. Like, I never, when I was your age, would have not, I mean, oh my God, my questions would have been much more high level. Some of what I've just described for you, like working with the gender advisor. So writing a 2-page brief for the Security Council, like generally that's not the forte of someone who's in the field. And not just because of, like, you know, English is probably their like second or third or fourth language, but because they're not often policy people, they're program people. They don't know the council members' personalities. So they'll tell me what's going on and I help them craft and shape things. So writing those policy briefs, tailoring them to the right audience. You know, I would always have a look at the Security Council's calendar, which is public on the Security Council agenda and website anyway, but we would get it ahead of time, see what's coming up, what are they talking about, what do I know that's going on and I need to keep them updated on. So it could be like writing briefings, but often I do a lot in person, and that is very typical. You're trying to get people to sit, I mean, this is COVID, so I'm talking not it being in a pandemic, but meeting like them one-on-one, getting coffee with people, saying to the UK or France or Belgium was a fabulous like supporter of gender equality on the council. Hey, like I want to catch you up with what's going on. So providing like really informal briefings to them. Helping to draft sections of, so I mentioned that there would be a written annual report for each of them. I talked about one mission. Again, there's 14 overall. I think there's gender units in 10. So 10 big reports that are being written every year, plus the annual Women, Peace and Security report, plus the conflict-related sexual violence report, plus a few the budget committee reports. So always writing the sections for those reports. They'll be a formal request, then I'll have to figure out what we want to answer in them. When negotiations are going on, sometimes you will be invited to the room to sit in and listen, to be there to answer any questions that might come up. You sometimes need to go back afterwards to look things up, to track things for them and come back with a better answer. So there's often round the clock questions when negotiations get tricky. I did not have WhatsApp until I started working after I came back from DC to New York and found out, okay, now this is how the Security Council is working. And so constantly WhatsApping, like answering questions. The civil society, there is civil society in New York. In Washington, there's the Civil Society Working Group on Women, Peace and Security. In New York, there's the NGO Working Group on 1325. And so meeting with them to see what they're hearing on the ground, what they want the council to be doing. Also promoting, some of it is just a lot of people don't, as probably none of you, and let me tell you, much really senior people in the State Department, often when I would meet with them, did not realize that there was a women peacekeeping agenda for most peacekeeping mandates. And so I would be telling them, yeah, peacekeeping actually does all these things. We actually help register women for elections. We actually help women run to, for office. And so being a bit of a sort of ambassador on that issue, with governments, US government. I went over to last year to Belgium to do a briefing for them. So I worked with their unit in New York, but then I worked very closely with their diplomats in New York. And they said, could you go to Belgium for us? Could you come to Brussels to brief our colleagues there to help them to better understand this issue? And then of course, boring stuff, but I also think it's important that everyone knows that every job always has boring components. So there's always administration. You don't have an assistant in these roles. You are always sort of looking up, doing things yourself, drafting things yourself, keeping your own calendar. So there's a lot of sort of mundane things to support really, I've been talking to you about the cool stuff, but there's a lot of, everyday admin too.
Elizabeth, can I ask you a question about women peacekeepers? And the numbers have increased in the last 20 years, but very slowly. It's still, what, 6% of all uniformed personnel are female. Can you tell us a bit more about what you experienced? I mean, obviously, there's been a lot of different papers published about the challenges and the barriers to women joining militaries and therefore being deployed to peacekeeping missions. But what were some of the barriers that you saw or heard about, even just anecdotally? Like what was your experience of that whole piece of the WPS agenda?
I mean, it's interesting. It's definitely certainly a priority in a real way. Both the Secretary General and the head of peacekeeping, and there's been a big push on this. There are all sorts of barriers. A lot of them are, I mean, there's practical and cultural, I think I would say. There's practical barriers in terms of like police and uniforms women, because there are simply not that many women in the national police departments, or especially, and even more so military in most countries. So when the UN is asking people to deploy, they don't even have enough women in the pipeline. So that's problem number one, and they need to all do better on that. But then there is the sort of cultural and implicit bias, where we would find out that, and you also have to have training. So not any military or police officer could be deployed to mission, right? And so more women were signing up for training. And then we started finding out the women have been trained, but they're just not getting on the rosters for deployment. And so that's this whole, oh, I don't think she's ready. Oh, I don't know if she really wants that. So there's that sort of nonsense, which still goes on. And there is still this, and there's also this idea that women are only good for community engagement. So when you're patrolling in the communities, we can send them out because they'll do a better job talking to civilians, particularly women and children. And that is seen as, often seen as a less desirable job. Certainly, you're not going to move up the ranks that way. And so then that's also challenging too, if you're trying to get women at higher positions. And the UN often has a problem because the Secretary General can appoint literally the top roles. So we have gender parity in the top. But it's that sort of middle level that's really tough. And that is both on the civilian side as well. There are more women civilians at headquarters. We're almost, I think it's like 45% women. But again, when you do the breakdown, it's not in the senior, so it's not in senior management. It's like mid-level management, we're pretty good, but then not the senior that's still, me, not a political appointee. There's still not a lot. I think there is a military feel still. People who come to it don't usually come from the NGO community. They come more from, even if not military backgrounds, like they were civilians, but they were doing like civilian military affairs or political military affairs. And there are fewer women who do that. Also in headquarters, more women for peacekeeping. It's a lot more staffed by people who are in the field. And not just doing anything in the field, like maybe you are with MSF or Save the Children, but just from a peacekeeping mission. And in the field, there aren't that many women peacekeepers, again, for a variety of reasons. Some of it is that you can't take your families out there, and not even necessarily that women are going to be the ones like, doing family duties at home. They may well have a husband who's happy to do all of that, but just, do you want to be a spouse in the field who's pretty much never going to get a job in the Central African Republic? So it's like, did you want to ask your family to move out there with you? And then the mindset of when women do get those jobs, we had a lot of women being hired at the junior levels in those jobs, but getting totally pissed off, because, to be frank, because they couldn't get promoted. So again, this old-fashioned idea of what does a senior peacekeeper look like, and is she qualified yet? Is she ready yet?
Thanks, Elizabeth.
So I think Beijing was unique because I think it was needed at that point in time, to legitimize the work of women's groups and to legitimize this agenda. I would not hold one. I would be against holding one. I think it's a huge waste of resources, to be honest. The bigger a meeting is, the less impact it's actually going to have. When you have a global meeting like that, what can actually, I mean, what can be done to your opening point? I mean, it's a terrible thing to say, but it's like, it's a little Hamilton song, right? In the room where it happens, and the smaller the room and the fewer the people, the more impact you often have. And so now you get to like millions of women or men. That's not a thing about women, but I mean, when we have the opening of the General Assembly, do you think anything really happens? Not at the big meetings, not because when things happen, it's because two ministers who've had a really hard time connecting are actually finally in New York together, and they're like, hey, let's go to the hot dog cart down the street where nobody's going to overhear us, and I can tell you what I've been dying to tell you, and I need your help on. And it's stuff like that. I mean, the only reason why I believe Commission on the Status of Women, which is, that is the annual meeting, and the meeting that was canceled this spring was the Commission on the Status of Women / meant to be the 20th World Conference, right? Or 25th, excuse me. It was 20 Women, Peace and Security, October 25th, CSW. The only positive thing would have been, I think it's a huge reinforcement and very helpful for women from countries where not that women in the United States haven't been freaking exhausted, but they are totally freaking exhausted because they have a terrible situation. There's no one showing support for them. They are really being targeted by their government. They have such little resources, and they can come to New York and then they can go back home and say, hey, I just spoke at the UN. I'm an important person, and more people pay attention to them. And that is absolutely true. Literally, that happens. And they can connect with people that they wouldn't be able to access normally. So on that individual level, for women from certain countries, it can be extraordinarily helpful. But in terms of would they be able to take any like big decisions or make any big decisions? No, they were not. And you may have discussed that there was a political declaration which was drafted ahead of time for this spring. It was not, I mean, it was just this nice thing. It was not really having any accountability. And there was a huge sort of discussion about what form that should take and what we should do. And same thing applied, as I just said about the council, and we asked for no more resolutions. Everyone knew that it's a more regressive atmosphere now in terms of women's rights than it literally was in 1995. And so they did not want to try to do anything too ambitious because they knew it would be torpedoed. Now, how much will things change next year with the Biden-Harris administration? Things will get better, but they can't change everything overnight. What will happen in other countries? In Eastern Europe, you have a lot of regressive regimes that have come in. In many other, the Philippines is a nightmare right now, right? All these other countries that are going through terrible things. So I would say to go to sort of smaller groupings. And I would also try to work through things like the EU and try to work through other bodies to push things. So symbolism, and I think back then it was like almost a perfect moment because there was a lot more progressive thinking because those things had never been laid down before. I don't think that is the forum now, and there would be other ways to achieve it, but we also need to build back this, and I didn't mean to again just quote the Biden-Harris agenda, but like we need to, build back better, and we need to say actually we are going to re-embrace the idea that women are people and that reproductive rights are important, and that, can you imagine like Lebanon? It's a middle-income country, highly educated, sophisticated country, but women can't give their citizenship to their child, and they are at risk of whatever religion they were being brought up in. Like, that's who governs, the laws that affect like the most intimate parts of their lives, and whether they can leave their husband or they'll be too vulnerable if they get divorced, even though he's beating you. So a lot needs to happen on a number of levels. Yeah, I'm talking too much.
No, that's amazing. Thank you, Elizabeth. Thank you for that very comprehensive answer, and your insights, especially as well around, the politics, obviously, and how just two ministers getting together can be much more impactful, over a coffee or whatever, than, like you say, than thousands of people.
I was providing someone with career advice last week, and she asked me what she should be doing to help improve her career possibilities, right? And maybe, I mean, this is like, sounds like an anti-intellectual answer, but I said, women are so worried all the time about like, oh, I need to publish another article. Oh, I need to get another qualification. Oh, I need to do this and I do that. And I'm like, first of all, if and I shouldn't say those things, like collecting things like that, like if that's what made you the Secretary of State or the UN Secretary General, then women would freaking be running the world, because we were very good at things like that. I don't think you should ever worry about, there's no silver bullet, right? I mean, and I'm sorry, do they call you Shirley? Because when I went to school, it would have been Professor Graham. So
Well, we have I always refer to myself as Shirley, but mostly my students refer to me as Professor or Professor Gray.
So
Yeah.
Professor Graham can tell you the same thing, which is like, it sounds too hippie for me to Shirley. My parents were not hippies. There's no silver bullet, right? There's nothing that like, I'm going to say to you that like, damn it, I should have done that. And I would be Secretary of State now. There is nothing like that. But the thing I said to her, maybe what I'll say to you is, I enjoy, and I think Progressive Graham and I agree on this one, we're like extroverted, we enjoy people. And I would say that when there are people that you meet that are smart and funny, and and you're like professionally, you think they're cool, get coffee. And it may be like you don't have any reason for doing a joint project with them or like emailing them with questions, but keep in touch with them. And like, so I guess this is networking, but like doing it in a real way, right? Like people that you want to be around, that you will just start learning from, they will benefit from a relationship with you. That sort of networking, I think, probably, if I have an asset or I've invested in one, it's that I have contacts in many, many capital cities around the world of people who would be happy to take a phone call from me or respond to an email, because, over the years, like I have grabbed lunch with them, coffee, breakfast, if you're a morning person, drinks, and you build a camaraderie and you will learn things. And you also, you have people there to support you, and that they'll call you for support and you'll be happy. And you also feel cool when people ask you for support and advice too. And it's sort of, if you can feel frustrated or down, then you get reminded, oh, actually, I am pretty good. I know a few things, and I just helped this person out. That's probably the best way I could answer your question.
I really like that, Elizabeth. And I think it's really important to stay connected to people you genuinely like. Do you know what I mean? It's not networking just for the sake of, finding your next job or, getting that promotion. It's genuinely they're your colleagues, but they're also your friends, and so it's been able to genuinely support each other. I think it makes such a big difference. Thank you for that, Elizabeth. Are there any final questions?
Sure. I am an optimistic person by nature, so you should just know that before I answer. And I probably do look for the positive things, even when things are difficult. I mean, like I said, I don't think that things are going to change. Things can't change overnight on January 21st, because we have a new administration, but we know that they are getting better. They will get better, and there's a huge team of people that are dedicated to making them better. And there are allies in the world who are freaking thrilled and going to work really hard with us. we have, I mean, we have massive challenges in terms of women's rights. What I think actually has been extremely interesting to me, and I haven't seen a lot of this in the papers, was that maybe 5 years ago or so, I mean, women's rights was not really a thing. And then suddenly, like, there was this, like, what do I want to call it? Like maybe in the 2010s, it suddenly was like trendy and corporatized. You know, there was like Glamour Women of the World Awards and like, you know, oh, empowered women. And it was really became this like Disneyfied corporate, like pink way of selling companies. Okay. And it was like women's empowerment is this really easy, happy, friendly, fashionable thing. And I really hated it because A, I was like, where were you like for the past 20 years? And then you were glossing over so many things. And then after the Trump win, I feel like the shit hit the fan and you realized how many, sorry, I did just say that, how many people actually were seething with this misogyny and that women's rights were actually this complicated, you know, not easy, controversial issue. And so I think lots of, you know, women suddenly were like, oh my God. And when Me Too exploded, all these people were like, I had no idea. And I'm like, really? So, I mean, I think, what am I trying to say? That the past 4 years have been super ugly, but I think they've made people realize that we need structural change, that you can't just have like, you know, I pick whatever company, like have a women's empowerment award and like hire an occasional woman to, you know, run your HR or your public affairs. And that's gender equality and things have changed. That this is like really long-term cultural structural work, and that there's a really, the pandemic has laid this bare too, right? Suddenly everyone's aware of maternal mortality and in different groups and how much more at risk like women are health wise if you're Black and Latina and all these things that, you know, Professor Graham and I knew, but like everyone else is suddenly realizing. And so I think now that people have acknowledged how sort of bad it is for women and other groups, that we have a chance to make things actually properly really better and in a sustainable way, even though this year has been extremely ugly. So I think people will be motivated to change things and will realize sort of like that this isn't a quick fix, that there's actually lots of things we need to change. I think, you know, peacekeeping, you asked that question too. Peacekeeping has been coming round to this. The Secretary General making gender equality and peace and security a priority for him when he became SG has been enormously helpful too. And so I think that we were a bit ahead of the curve working on these things. And peacekeeping has been under the gun because of the cuts I mentioned due to the Trump administration. But actually, again, I'd say that's been a good thing for them. They've had to make some efficiencies in the field. They've had to look at how they work. And so I think that we're headed to a better place. And I think actually, again, so I'm saying like, ironically, the very bad place we were in is going to help us make things better.
Thank you for that very honest answer, Elizabeth. And like you say, there, you know, positive things have come out of all of this, even if it's just to see how ugly things are and how much work needs to be done. But so thank you for that.
This could be a lecture in and of itself, right? It depends who you are, first of all, like the latitude that you have to respond depends on whether you're a UN international civil servant, you're a diplomat, you're an NGO. UN international civil servants have to be the most diplomatic with their perspectives. Member states can be more blunt if in the service of their country's positions and priorities, and NGOs are in the luxury position of they can pretty much say whatever they want, and oftentimes I have gone to them saying, I can't say this, can you please say this? So there's a tag teaming that happens there that can be quite productive. I mean, I would say so if there's a singular meeting, then you probably came in with a strategy knowing what people's positions are going to be, and you've planned for that. But longer term engagement is always the best way. So continued dialogue, and figuring out why they hold that position, what they expect to, where they're coming from. So what's the background to that position, and what they're hoping to achieve by holding that position. So two different things actually you need to take into consideration. And that is how you will frame how you address it. Because some people hold positions for ideological reasons. Some have data that may be faulty, and I'm not even talking about like fake news, but just like old data, not comprehensive, didn't realize something that was happening. So you have to figure out what it's based on, so that you can respond to it in the appropriate way. Having one talking point for everyone never works if you're really trying to accomplish something. And then also, again, what are they hoping to achieve? If you know, then you can figure out like, what do they really want? Maybe what they really want isn't that thing, and you can say like, you can help them achieve what they need to, but still get what you want, whether it's actual horse trading, or whether it's saying like, what you're trying to do is not mutually, and what I'm trying to do are not mutually exclusive. So if there are conservative actors who are like, oh, you just want, and literally you could have, this is just to like break down the traditional family and undermine, motherhood. And then so you have to say, actually, no, we just want to make sure, that, women have, yes, women, we're not undermining women's rights here, but we want them to have these other opportunities. And when, women have education and jobs, we know that their children are more likely to achieve in school. It actually helps, strengthen what you are trying to do as well. So, things like that. All right, I'm just stopping.
Wonderful, Elizabeth. Very smart. Thank you for that. So look, I think we're going to have to leave it there. I know, Elizabeth, we could listen to you for another hour at least, much longer. You've got this incredible wealth of experience and knowledge, but you're also a brilliant storyteller. I'm hanging on every single word here, and I can see all the heads nodding as well. So it's been so interesting and entertaining listening to you. I think if you ever decide to go on a career trajectory, a kind of a one-woman show, recounting 30 cancer intrigue, and I definitely go to that one. But listen, thank you so much. So I'd like everybody to unmute for a moment and give Elizabeth a round of applause and just say thank you so much. Thank you, Elizabeth. So take care.
You're very welcome. Thank you. Very happy. That was fun. All right. Have a good rest of your evening.
Take care, Elizabeth. Bye. Bye-bye.